her statement that she made is it's difficult reading, isn't it? I think when you have
Very
to sit
difficult.
down and read it, it's tough going, I think, to read the detail of what happened to them.
Vicious. It shows the black and tans in the true light. Yeah, so it does.
So following the Burgery ambush, it was really women who, I suppose, suffered the fallout of what happened over 2 weeks, over a 2-week period. And it was actually on April the 3rd, 1921, that 2 black and tans came banging on the door of Miss Bridget Fahey. Bridget at the time was at home alone with her barmaid, Bridget O'Neill, and her very young son, who was 7 at the time.
A lot of people say that the people then back waited for the knock on the door to come at night, and you had no choice but open the door. And when she opened the door, she was faced with 2 serious men, 2 black and tans.
Bridget's husband, Thomas, was actually in Kilworth prison in Cork. He'd been arrested a month earlier, and so the women were known to be alone. So again, they were easy targets. It was late at night. They were closing up. The women really had no choice but to let the men in. So during that night, the women endured a really terrifying and quite a horrendous ordeal. It's without doubt, I think, one of the most difficult statements to read. Bridget, but also Minnie Fitzgerald, who would have lived just around the corner. The men really held them hostage for a number of hours. They went away and returned. There's a number of references to the women where there was threats of sexual violence, and again, this is really just briefly mentioned, and it's they move on quite quickly. I think it's difficult to understand for those women just how terrifying those events must have been. They really must have wondered, were they going to survive at all that night?
Drink and sex was on their mind that night, both of them.
And to have the young son there as well, you can only imagine that it left a great deal of trauma, and those women must have suffered this trauma for many years after. The following morning or 2 days after, she visited the castle and gave a detailed statement to the constable. During that period, Bridget and Bridget O'Neill both identified just one of the men. There's only ever mention of one of the men, so we don't know what happened with the second man that was there, but he was certainly identified, and a court date was also set, and the constable assured the women that they were going to be safe to go home and not worry anymore. Then 7 days later, the black and tans returned to Bridget's house, and they returned to a number of houses on that night. While the 2 women and the son were in bed, they began setting the house on fire. The women woke up and tried to flee, and unfortunately they couldn't escape through the front door. They ended up going through the backyard. The barmaid had tried to go into the house because the young child was upstairs still, and one of the black and tans initially stopped her, tried to stop her from going in. And if anyone knows that area, it's very much built up and surrounded by houses, and they had to scale a 12-foot wall really to survive. But by the end of the incident, the women, they were one of 12 women really that were attacked, numerous stages over a 2-week period. But Bridget and her family were left completely penniless. They were left homeless, and it would be another year before their house was in any way habitable again. And it was the women of Cumann who looked after these women and housed them for 6 months to a year, including Birdie Handley. She was one of the women who would have housed the women. And when the court date came, Bridget didn't turn up for the court date, and it's really hardly surprising. I mean, when you imagine if the burning of their house and almost killing of her family was a threat not to attend court, you can really understand why Bridget did not attend court during that incident. But I think it's a really harrowing incident, and it really highlights the violence, the unspoken violence that went on with women during this period.
I think it was probably one of the most vicious attacks that I've ever read of about women that suffered during that period.
And I think there's still an element of people not wanting to discuss that trauma and not wanting to relive it. For even in our own research, we found that there was a number of incidents where we come across a number of incidents, violent incidents, in particular the trauma that women suffered afterwards. A number of women suffered nervous breakdowns, they were hospitalised, and I think what's often said is the women had ill health after, and that's a way really of saying that the women, they suffered the trauma of the aftermath of these events.